Hey everybody, it's What's Up Mike on a Tuesday. Talk today about judgment. I spoke to a teacher friend of mine, and that's what they struggle to teach kids the most, especially in high school. Good judgment, how to do it. It was my biggest fear going into leadership in the Army, especially the idea of leading in combat. So what helps with good judgment, and what gives you the answers to the tough decisions in the moment? Let's figure it out. All right, Tuesday. I figured out my intro music on a little iPhone thing here. So I've got like a little mini drop board on my iPhone. I have a soundboard, like a thing with all the knobbies and buttons and stuff. So that's cool. But for drops, like sound effects, not a lot of sound effects here. But for this, I have this thing. See the little drop button on there? If you're watching on YouTube, see the video. It's pretty cool. Lets me play my intro jingle. So judgment and good decision making. Anyway, I spoke to a high school teacher friend who's someone I met through jiu-jitsu, who this guy actually looks weirdly like Josh Potter, one of the producers on Your Mom's House and a stand-up comedian. It threw me for a loop for a minute there. Anyway, great guy. And most people I run into in jiu-jitsu are fantastic people. There's something about it. But we talked a lot about what he struggles to teach high schoolers the most, and he gave me some examples about high school students that had just poor judgment in the moment. I mean, got offended about something, and so they threw their classmate down and kicked them in the head. Felony assault charge. 17-year-old with a felony assault. Maybe it'll get wiped from their record. Maybe they don't go to juvie, but Jesus, man. Like, talk about things that can possibly fuck up your life super early into the gig, man. Like, hey, maybe try and don't knock someone up or get knocked up before you're out of high school. It works. I know plenty of people who live amazing, productive, successful lives having been knocked up in high school. No hate against any of that. I have friends who had kids in high school or right afterwards who were fantastic people. Anyway, caveats aside, don't get a felony assault charge in high school. And it comes down to judgment, right? Like, what do you do if somebody says something that bothers you a lot? Do you immediately attempt to beat the shit out of them? Usually not what the situation calls for. But how do you teach that to somebody? Like, that's not a real easy thing to figure out. And then, for me, there's this scene. It's this scene that sticks out in my head. It's from Band of Brothers, and it is the moment in film or media where it looked like a judgment magic trick to me. Like, how did he know to say that at that time? I mean, granted, it's just a movie or miniseries, whatever, HBO miniseries. But what it is what was his name? The lieutenant who was a super badass. Spears. So, Lieutenant Ronald Spears. It's the scene when they're trying to take the village of Foy, and I've personally been to the village of Foy in Belgium, where this scene was where Easy Company and the 101st assaulted across an open area up a hill in order for this scene in Band of Brothers. This scene really happened. It is a historical event. I'm not sure exactly how Lieutenant Spears was involved in real life, but I went there. I stood in that field. I stood in the place in the Band of Brothers show where this happened, right? This piece of media was depicted. And so what happens is Lieutenant Dyke, I think is Captain Dyke, whatever, the dude who's in charge freezes and gets relieved, right? And and I think he dies in the scene. He freezes, can't move, and the hay bale that he's behind eventually gets blown up. And what that shows is that the lack of ability to make decisions when it's important to make quick decisions will get you killed in combat. And that's something that is repeated quite often. It's an all-the-time kind of repetition when it comes to military education. Like poor decision-making, irresponsible decision-making, but also a lack of decisiveness will get you killed in combat. And so that's pitched all the time. So I'm thinking, this is me in high school, and then eventually like as a plebe at West Point, as like trying to figure out where I fit into this whole world, knowing I'm going into the military as an officer. I got anxiety about like, would I have the ability to have that level of judgment that Lieutenant Spears shows in that moment, in that scene, when I lead in combat, right? Because I knew that was coming. So in the scene, Spears, so Captain Winters, or Major Winters at the time, who's a Battalion XO, I think, Battalion Executive Officer, sees one of his company commanders failing. He sees his lack of decision-making ability, his lack of decisiveness in general, and he watches it getting people killed. He's watching it in front of him, freaking out, and is about to run into the field when his commanding officer says, "Major Winters, don't you take another step forward." He immediately grabs Lieutenant Spears, tells him to go relieve the commander, and Spears takes off running, runs directly into a hail of bullets, runs through exploding shells, gets to his subordinate elements, and says, "Hey, where's Captain Dyke? All right, he's relieved. I'm in charge." And then immediately gives out instructions, all of which play out exactly how you'd hope they would play out, right? He tells the mortars, "Hey, you orient your mortars here, fire until this threat is gone. You go over here and do this, you go over here and do this. I'm going to go do this." And then he takes off to link up with another unit, which ensures the success of the subsequent mission and firefight. So in that moment, it's like this thing that sticks out as a figment in my mind is the best possible example of good judgment under stress in an arduous situation, in a dangerous situation where it has to happen now or everyone dies, right? The most extreme example of when judgment's incredibly important. So this stuck out in my mind, and also created, like any ideal that you have is also a judgment. If your ideal is to be a non-smoker, you having that ideal makes every cigarette you smoke a self-judgment, right? So any ideal is a judgment, and they kind of parallel each other. And so I had this as the ideal in my head, and was constantly judging myself on whether or not I would be on that level or was on that level, which is kind of an impossible thing to try and attain. And so, that's one of the scariest parts of leadership, is wondering if you're going to be able to make that decision in the moment. And the military highlights that because it's life and death shit, right? So, but I think I figured something out I commanded in combat, successfully, I think. Did a full deployment as I did 3, but I did 1 as a company commander, and I did not lose anyone, right? Like, I think 98% of that is luck, but maybe I was responsible for 2% of why we brought everybody home. And so, anyway, I'll at least talk about what I've figured out to make it so that judgment problem, when it matters, isn't as big of a mountain to climb, and then how I've sort of tried to translate that a little bit. So, in the military, the life and death decisions, right? Like, that's what amplifies all of this. And so the military has to figure out a system, and they have, obviously, to figure out a system to prep people for those decisions, so that people can actually have the capability to make those decisions, because they're coming, right? So there's a thing in the military called standard operating procedures, and any of my military friends have many experiences with SOPs, good and bad, but that's something that's universal throughout the military, is creating standard operating procedures. They vary by unit because so much of it is how individuals want things done. They have to abide by doctrine, but aren't dictated by field manuals or doctrine. You make these things on your own. They go beyond what the field manuals and doctrine mandate. And so, the military pushes the development of standard operating procedures. So what does that do? A standard operating procedure is something simple that's done regularly, and you just create a standard for it, so it's done the same way every time, and everybody knows it, and then you don't have to discuss that method every time to get people on the same page. Simple, efficient way for getting things that have to get done regularly done. So the way this helps is it just takes shit off your plate, right? So families have standard operating procedures to make dinner time better, right? Their families, if your family has dinner at a pretty similar time every night, bedtime for the kids at a pretty similar time, predictable bath time. That's a standard operating procedure, so you don't have to dictate those things happen at a certain time every day, less decisions to make, right? So building standard operating procedures for things you do regularly so that you don't have to constantly readdress the method, give the instruction out again. You standardize things that are easy to standardize so you have less decisions to make, which gives you more time and more ability to think through the important ones. The military goes over the top on standard operating procedures to get the maximal effect out of that, right? Consistent action for similar activities in a unit, efficiency of action, especially on the objective, in a firefight, in a military environment. There's just no option to ask, well, how do we flex cuff enemy prisoners of war or detainees again? Like, do we use the flex cuffs or the handcuff? All that. That's a terrible example, but whatever. Standard operating procedures. If you standardize the simple decisions and the simple things that you have to do, the repeatable tasks, you make a standard for that. You don't have to communicate it anymore, and it's less things to decide on and communicate, right? So, the military kind of gives you tools like that, and then builds a laboratory for you to go through those kinds of decisions and screw it up a bunch with lots of adult supervision, right? Because these decisions are going to be life and death. Might as well have some practice. And so the way the military approaches that is they put lieutenants under a captain, a commander who's done this before and who has the actual legal command authority. Lieutenants in the Army, platoon leaders, don't have legal command authority. It's a different thing. So it's almost like a trial position, a trial run at leadership when you're a lieutenant. What you don't realize when you're a lieutenant, you feel like the world's on your shoulders and that whole platoon, those 40 people's lives depend on you. Your company commander's got it, or the system is built so that it's on them, not you as a lieutenant. And so they give you this laboratory to, with heavy command supervision, and those first leadership jobs become that trial run. You get to make lots of mistakes. They create training scenarios that replicate the same kinds of decisions, let you fuck it up, let you get more reps in, let you figure out how to do it right, that kind of thing. So standardizing simple shit to get it off your plate as regular decisions that need to be made, and then lots and lots of practice with the subject matter. Pretty simple concepts. And then from there, the standard operating procedures get a lot of shit handled for you without having to make those decisions. And after that, all it is priorities and intent. What are your highest priorities and what's your general intent for how you want things done, right? Because from there, that kind of guides everything else. Right? You set your moral and ethical boundaries as the start of that, right? So you set the boundaries of what you will and won't do morally and ethically. You figure out what your intent for the general subject is, and whether this is leading a small business, leading your family, leading the people around you, your friend group, your neighborhood, your whatever it is, the conversation in the cul-de-sac, how to go about a disagreement with your neighbor about this tree and whose property is it. Like, if you have your intent set, which is I'm here to develop a community within my neighborhood, conflicts over things that are less than $1,000 in value or less than $10, whatever you set that line at, are like conflicts over things that are lower than that dollar amount, don't align with the intent of developing a good community within your neighborhood or cul-de-sac or whatever. So if you're following your own intent for what you're trying to get done, you let the little shit slide, and that decision's easy to make because you know what your intent is. If you get caught up in the moment and you haven't thought about these things ahead of time, you think, fuck my fucking asshole neighbor. He can fucking pay for the tree limb to be trimmed. The tree comes from his property. Fuck it. Screw him. And you get into that momentum and that emotion before you realize you're violating your own intent with what you're trying to do, over the long term in your neighborhood. Maybe that's another shitty example. But I think it illustrates the point outside of a military context, right? With a small business, you have to push, part of this standard operating procedures, when you standardize things like that, it allows decisions to be pushed lower so they're made and handled before they get to you. right? So if you have a small business with 5 people on the team, right? Let's say you've got a landscape. Here's a good example of some shit I don't work in, but maybe this will work. You have a landscaping business and you have a crew out and you're not out with them. They run into an issue where the homeowner wants them to do more than they thought they were going to show up to do, and it's going to screw up their schedule for the rest of the day if they have to stay for that extra 20 minutes. Well, that's a difficult situation, right? Like, you're worrying about delaying other clients. Well, if you have a standard operating procedure for that addresses it and you've thought about it ahead of time, well, then that crew might know what to do in that situation without having to call you. And if they know what to do, they can handle it, let you know how they handled it, and you can move forward from there. But if they don't know what to do and you haven't standardized what to do in that situation, if you haven't told them to say, hey, if you ever run into a situation where there's a discrepancy between what services you're tracking need to be rendered, what services the client is expecting, err on the side of what the client is expecting and let us catch it up after the fact, keep the client happy in the moment, let the ownership of the company address it with them after the fact, but just make a note that it happened and how it happened, and then how you handled it, and just err on the side of keeping the client happy until things begin to get unreasonable in your book. If it looks like they're not operating with integrity, if it looks like they're lying to you and bullshitting you to get more out of it, do it anyway. We'll make that judgment and I'll address it with them. But never, ever get into an argument with the client in their front yard, because that does nothing for our company. Boom. Got that? Got the standard? Okay, good. If you have that conversation and do that planning ahead of time, and then also plan for how that crew, give guidance on how that crew has to deal with schedule delays because of one on-site delay for one job that day, and how that trickles down for the rest of the day's schedule. If you've got those procedures worked out, which takes some work and upfront planning, that's why people don't do this shit, right? It's not easy. It's not simple in a lot of cases. You actually have to do some work there. But if you do that ahead of time, set your standard operating procedures, and then tell them, hey, the reason why we set this up is because my intent is for me to handle the difficult situations so you guys can just get the work done. I'm not trying to put you in uncomfortable, difficult situations where you don't know what to do all day. I'm trying to give you yards to mow and money to make. So if you give them that intent and then say, also, no individual job is worth an argument in a front yard. So just make them happy until it gets unreasonable. If it gets unreasonable, call me and put me on the phone with the client. Easy for you. I'm trying to make this easy for you, hard for me. I'll deal with those tough decisions. You operate with this intent and these standard procedures. And number one, your crew thinks you're taking care of them. They know you're taking care of them. They know what your intent is, why you're telling them to do what you're telling them to do. They can take that intent, expand upon it, and address situations you haven't even given them as examples yet because they know what's behind the logic. Standard operating procedures take care of all the little shit. You have less decisions to make. And then one of the big ones comes onto your desk. You're not overwhelmed. You can take the amount of time you need to address it. So anyway, that's the idea, right? Like, build some standards, establish your intent and your priorities, communicate that fully, and in my experience, if you're not an asshole to people and you're not looking to exploit people and you don't have that history with someone and people generally trust you at least a little bit, when you start to do this, things start to handle themselves on their own. Like, people will actually follow your intent because people want guidance. They want to be led. They don't want enough rope to hang themselves with. So, once you get that little shit handled with standard operating procedures, set your moral and ethical framework, communicate your priorities and your intent with why you're trying to get done what you're trying to get done, and, it works. Like, my priorities are the health of my family and my community, followed by the health and outlook of my primary business endeavor and, subsequent side projects and so on and so on. And so when it comes to work-related decisions, I make my priorities and intent clear to the staff, push every decision down to the lowest level that we can responsibly push it to, and that clears my plate as the owner for important shit and client problems and things that have to be addressed by an owner. So Yeah, it's never really about knowing exactly what to say in the moment during that difficult decision. It's about setting the framework and the foundation so that when you get to that decision, everybody's in the right place and you're clear of mind and you've already sorted through all of your priorities, all of your moral and ethical framework, what you're actually trying to get done in whatever arena that is. And then you just go with your gut, because usually once all that foundation is set, your gut feeling is going to line up with that perfectly fine. So anyway, there you go, man. That's 20 minutes on how I figured out how to not lose sleep over difficult decisions. And what I found is that I fucked it up less often than I got it to an okay standard. I don't know. You mess up less often than you don't, I think, when you do it that way. So, yeah. If you got some thoughts on that, then hey, working with Judgement on a Tuesday. And business is still going well in other news. Kids are still cooped up, still quarantining. 34 people where my wife works have coronavirus. Positive tests. Shit's getting lively. I joke and I get crazy about that sometimes and speak outlandishly, but shit, man. It's scary for a lot of people. It's uncertain times. Yeah. Stay safe out there, maybe, but at least stay sane out there. Thanks for listening, and we will see you tomorrow. What's up, Mike? Maybe we'll be live on YouTube soon. Trying to get these first episodes up on YouTube. They're just on Apple Podcasts right now. But yeah, all coming soon. Thanks for listening.